Hello, friends, and welcome to this bi-weekly episode of the CGIS Brief. Today we're doing a mini identity dive over Fat Bodies Go Abroad. And just a reminder that this is a casual conversation, so feel free to pop into the chat. We'll be talking from our experience and also over some research that we've done. So I think that this is going to be a great opportunity for us all to learn. So let's get started. My name is Ashton Troxel, and I'm an Intercultural Programs Advisor in CGIS, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm joined by my two co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Stephen Gonzalez. I'm the Communication Specialist here at CGIS, and my pronouns are he, him, his.
And I am Callie Rouse, pronouns she, her, hers, and I am the CGIS Health and Safety Assistant. I was going to say advisor, but that's my boss's job.
And today we have a very special guest joining us, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi there, my name is Katie Wiggins-Golick. I am a Global Education Advisor with Ross Global Initiatives at the Stephen M. Ross School of Business, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Thank you. And just a quick reminder to feel free to use the chat since we just had some people join, and I'm going to pass it on to Callie to get started with why it matters.
Awesome. So why are we actually talking about fat bodies going abroad? So the first thing I wanted to address is the word fat in the title. So oftentimes people like to kind of use like alternate words when talking about fat people, when saying like, oh, curvy, plus size, bigger boned and things like that. But there's definitely been a movement towards fat positivity and fat acceptance, as well as the Hayes Health at Every Size movement that has really pushed towards using fat in a regular day-to-day context as just an identity and moving away from the kind of moralized idea of what fatness and fat people are. And so we're going to be using that word throughout the presentation. It's really important to talk about this subject in particular is because cultural understandings and relationships each individual has around the world with fatness really differs. It doesn't exactly look the same as it does here in America. It's also important to kind of think a little bit about the racist and colonial roots of diet culture and a version of fatness. It really was very much rooted in, like the diet of the Europeans was better than the indigenous folks when they, came and colonized in the Americas, or the idea that, curvy bodies and things like that were not good. They were a sign of like a different ethnicity, and white people were nice and perfect and very skinny. And so it's really important to kind of recognize that ideal and that conception is rooted in these two elements. Also, an important thing is that just fat travelers are going to experience travel differently. We're going to be talking about in a couple of different ways that may look, such as like access to certain items or having to think about certain things ahead of time that your straight size peers don't have to. So that's important to mention as well. And of course, if you are yourself are not fat, or if you are a smaller fat person, it is important to be an ally and to know, what challenges that your peers may be facing that you may not think about because you don't have to. And so, I myself can speak to some of this relates to me and some of this that I can get by on. And that's really important to kind of have that knowledge going in, whether you're a fat person yourself or not.
All right, so we are going to start with East Asia, and we'll talk a little bit about Southeast Asia and a little bit as well. There is a lot of information and a lot of different experiences that come up when you begin to search navigating Asia as a plus-size person. As someone who thinks a lot about traveling with a visible identity, and because many parts of Asia seem to be homogenous, it makes sense why people with visible identities stick out more. So I'm going to highlight some experiences and tips that I found from plus-size people who have navigated themselves through Asia. And one of the things that came up the most was finding clothing that fit. I was reading in several blogs that across Asia, most people seem to be weight conscious, and a lot of these businesses are refusing to manufacture larger clothing sizes. Um, and there was actually a study that was done on 31 stores across Asia, and on how many on how many of them actually carried plus size options, and 70% of them did not, while the remaining 30% only carried sizes up to XL. And so that is a nice segue into how plus size can look different in other countries, but in this case in particular in Asia. In the context of Singapore, most vendors will say that they carry plus size clothing, but in reality, they actually just mean up to XXL. And we know very well that there are people out there that require larger sizes. So that can definitely be an obstacle. Something that was popping up that is becoming really common in Singapore and in China are dedicated boutiques for plus size people. I found this one article that is entitled "Where to Buy Plus Size Women's Clothes and Shoes in Japan." A lot of them seem to suggest that sizes up to 6L can be found. Some of those stores in there are actually unisex clothing as well. So if you're a man interested in looking for clothing, I think things like Uniqlo was listed in there as well. So you might also want to check that out. But it's really going to come down to knowing your body shape. I think, here in the States, it's very rare that you come across an article of clothing. I think like in store, when I go to the mall and I get a large, I expect it to fit me. And then maybe it's like 2 sizes smaller. This is actually something that's very common in Asia. You may pick out something that is labeled something, and it may actually be a smaller size than what you're used to. So know your measurements. If you're shopping online, definitely utilize those size charts before you make a purchase. If you can, try things on before purchasing, just to make sure that you're, that it fits and that, you're not purchasing something smaller. I found this blog by Kiara Liu, who happens to be a friend of Katie's, actually. But she mentioned utilizing apps like WeChat and Alipay. These are 2 apps that are utilized frequently across Asia. In her experience in China, she really couldn't get anywhere without using this app. I guess you use this app to pay for different markets or different grocery stores. Some places won't even let you in if you don't have the app. But she found in WeChat a dedicated group to finding plus size clothing. Unfortunately, people with various identities, but in this case in particular, you have to be creative of how you're going to navigate yourself abroad. So definitely be thinking about this ahead of time. If there are groups that you can find, I know I found a lot of like subreddits about people giving their own advice about how to shop for plus size clothing abroad. So definitely look through all of that. There's plenty of people that have already experienced that. Smaller spaces. So this is something that is, I think it becomes more apparent because if you're like, let's say you're in a metropolis city where you tend to have larger populations, places like public transportation might be an issue. I read that trains are actually more accessible for plus size people versus buses where they are not. Oftentimes they're even more crowded. So you're definitely gonna have to be thinking about how you're gonna navigate space in that sense. Restaurants are a little bit different as well. So more traditional restaurants, more like the hole in the walls where the food is really good, are always gonna have traditional seating. So you may either find yourself sitting on the floor, or they might have like really tight, compact booths or tables with bar stools, and it's just going to be really, really crowded. There are though restaurants that will probably cost you a little bit more in money, but are totally accessible for plus size people. I actually found that a lot of people just were willing to pay a little bit more just for the comfort of feeling good in their space. So there are places that you can find to eat. And again, this is definitely something you can probably find ahead of time. One thing that also came up was people might try to touch you and confront you about being plus size. This is something that has come up when we talk to Black and African Americans traveling abroad, how people, you know, you're realizing probably that you may be the first person, either a person of color or a plus size person that these people have ever seen, and they may want to take a picture of you. I know a couple of blogs suggested that one was being followed by a person taking their pictures. Another person went to like a spa, and the woman that was helping her scrub asked her to wash off, and then she came out of the shower and the woman just like slapped her stomach and laughed and kept slapping her stomach and laughing. And for her, it was like one of those experiences where like, is this really happening? Is my belly really being slapped right now? And the woman is like clearly like acting like a child and just having a good time with her, but not really with the intention of trying to be malicious. And I like that Kiara Lu wrote this quote, people have the bluntness of a kid here. If you're not used to that, it will stress you out. They don't mean what they say to be mean. They're just stating things as a fact. When you talk to them about it, do it in private. China is all about saving face. So if you lecture them in public, they will lose face and be embarrassed. They might end up more mad at you than anything else. I'll talk a little bit later about intercultural exchange, but these are really one of those experiences that is going to define your time abroad. I think how you choose to handle a situation is really going to be super important. I know we talk about safety, right? Like, well, one, you have to recognize that you're in another country. You're nowhere near anyone that knows you. Also, the culture is different, right? And like we're talking about how these people might not have a malicious intent. They're really just trying to understand themselves, and they might be doing it in a way that is uncomfortable to you. But I think understanding first and foremost that they're not coming from that place of malicious intent, it might be a good starting point to figuring out how you're going to handle that situation. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later down the road.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So talking about Southeast Asia and particularly my experience and observations in India, I would definitely echo smaller spaces, hard to find clothes, and then definitely like unwanted attention of people touching or just trying to take pictures of you secretly, or maybe not so secretly, like very blatantly taking selfies of themselves with you in the background. But I will say that there is a big range of body sizes in India, and based on my observation, I noticed that it was a lot of like older married women who tended to be fat. And so there are, obviously there are clothes available if you are trying to shop. But if you're going to like the mall and shopping at places that are similar to what Forever 21 would be in that country, it would be very difficult. But one really good thing about Asia in general is there's lots of access to like beautiful fabrics, and getting clothes custom made is pretty affordable. So, as a traveler, this may be a little bit more difficult, but if you talk to, whoever works at the hostel or the hotel that you're staying at, they could definitely point you in the right direction of, what market to go to buy a fabric and, where to find a tailor. The hotel may even have someone on staff who could do that for you. And then clothes in India tend to be very forgiving. Like saris, you buy this 6-yard long piece of fabric, and then it comes with another uncut, unsewn piece of fabric that is to make a customized shirt for you. So if you're a female traveling in India and you want, something special to take home, regardless of your size, that's something that you can get, which is, I think, really neat about traveling there. And then I just wanted to make a comment of whether you're really tall, like if you're over 6 feet tall, or like Stephen said, if you're Black or you're white, you may be the very first person like that those people have seen. So you're just going to attract attention, and they're not being malicious. They're just curious. And also referring to someone as fat isn't necessarily rude, and they're not meaning to hurt your feelings. They're just like, oh yeah, your friend Beth, the fat one. They didn't mean anything by it, but like me as an American, I'm like, why did you say that about her? But they didn't mean anything. So yeah, we'll talk about intercultural preparedness a little bit more. But if you kind of have these expectations before you go, it's a little bit easier to deal with. On that note, I'm going to pass it on to Katie to talk about Europe.
Thank you. So most of my experiences traveling outside the United States are in Europe and Latin America. I had the opportunity to live and work in Spain for a number of years in my 20s. And overall, I would say that perceptions of fatness vary from country to country in Europe. But overall, I think thin bodies are most heavily upheld as the ideal. And so that can be really challenging, but in a lot of ways, it's not so different from the United States, with thinness also being the ideal that's upheld. So if you are planning on traveling within Europe, it definitely helps to do country-specific research. For example, in Spain, bluntness is very kind of a common facet of language and culture and how people express themselves. And it's not necessarily, as we've said in previous slides, it's not intended as a rude thing or to be mean. It's just the way people talk. But again, that emotional labor of how you feel when people talk to you in a way that you're not usually talked to can be really, really heavy. And I want to acknowledge that. And so I've had experiences where I was in a shop in Spain and was coming back to the US in a couple months and was going to celebrate a friend's birthday while I was here. And so I decided I wanted to buy her a dress from Spain. So I went to the shop, and my friend is very thin. She's maybe like a size 2 or 4. And so I was holding up dresses. At the time, I was, size 16, 18, definitely not anywhere near the size that would fit in these dresses that I was holding up. So I'm, holding up a few dresses, trying to figure out what one I might buy for her. And the shopkeeper literally came over to me and took the dresses forcefully out of my hands. It was like, no, you are much too fat to wear these. And I was just like, okay. And just left. Not, if that were to happen to me now in my 30s and having come a lot further in my journey of fat positivity and body positivity and really understanding the fat liberation movement and how I identify with that, I would have a much different response now, the person that I am, but the person that I was in my 20s, when I lived in Spain, was not prepared to respond. And I was just like, okay. And just kind of welled up tears and walked out and kind of dealt with it on my own. But I think that was my first introduction into my body is an identity that people can talk about. It's something that that people will talk about, and that it's a very visible identity that I can't really ever hide. And so definitely do your research as you're thinking about traveling. I haven't had those same experiences in other European countries, for example, in the UK, in Denmark, Sweden, Norway. I never had a very blunt experience like that. And it was much more, I would say, politically correct in the way that people kind of viewed my body or talked about it. So definitely do your research so that you feel prepared for how culturally people might perceive you. Definitely one thing in Europe that's very prominent is this American stereotype. So Americans are, fat, and they're not just fat, but they're unhealthy fat, which, health at every size is a whole another movement that we don't have time to talk about today, but those things are not equivalent. And so Americans are unhealthy, they're fat, they only eat cheeseburgers, and they eat cheeseburgers 3 times a day, and that's all they ever eat. And big American breakfast with pancakes and bacon every day. And Americans are lazy and uneducated. And so for me, I am fat. I love cheeseburgers, but not because I'm fat and not because I'm American, but because cheeseburgers are freaking delicious. And So to like walk into a space where people were like, oh, you're American because you're fat. I'm like, those things they're not like mutually, they're not one and the same. I just happen to be American and I happen to be fat and I happen to like cheeseburgers. And so that I think was another really formative experience for me as a fat person, a fat American living in Europe, was like learning how to navigate people, like how people perceived me in that stereotype, and like navigate some of that language when people would automatically assume I was American because I was fat. And like, oh yeah, you're right, I am American, but like that being fat doesn't make you American, And so so that I think was really challenging for me, but they were also really formative experiences for me as a young traveler in Europe. And so we are going to talk a little bit more about the intercultural learning and understanding piece, but definitely as a fat traveler, I had so many amazing experiences living in Spain. I learned to surf. I traveled all over the place. Like I never let my body size dictate what I could or couldn't do. It definitely presented challenges sometimes, but you can always find ways around it. And so in Latin America, I think you'll see that there sometimes are some conflicting societal messages. So for women, the expectation is that you're supposed to be curvy, but also thin. And there's this like kind of dual conflicting standard of being like the ideal shape or the ideal woman, where you're kind of like Jennifer Lopez's body type, where very curvy, but very thin at the same time. And so that can be really challenging because there are very few people that fit into that type of body standard. And I suppose really in any ideal body standard, like there's very few people that tend to fit that ideal, but especially because those two things tend to conflict, that can be really challenging. Another thing, especially in Spanish language, obviously Spanish isn't the only language spoken in Latin America, but the term gordito or gordita as a term of endearment. So literally gordito, gordita, little fat one or little fatty. And the first time I am white, I did not grow up in a Latinx household or community. And my first time traveling in Latin America as a Spanish speaker, being called gordita as a term of endearment was really, kind of shocking. So definitely be prepared for that. And the fat acceptance movement in Latin America, I would say, still in its very early stages. And so especially if you are someone who's fat positive and about fat liberation and health at every size, like you might find that there are not a whole lot of people in Latin America that are familiar with that school of thought and are familiar with that branch of like social advocacy and social justice towards fat bodies. And so in larger cities, you might find a community of people that are familiar with it, but especially in rural areas of Latin America, most people will probably never have heard of like fat acceptance or fat liberation. And one last thing, since we kind of talked about fashion in Asia, in Latin America, it can also be pretty challenging to find clothes that fit you, especially in like mainstream stores. But I think what's even harder oftentimes is that when you do find clothes that fit you, they're not like stylish necessarily or trendy. Oftentimes those clothes are just designed to cover up your body, which is, a frustrating experience all around. But so keep that in mind, that it can be more challenging to find clothes that fit you. And then when you do find clothes that fit you, it can be even harder to find clothes that are on trend or like fitting with your particular style that you might like to dress.
So let's talk a little bit about Africa. I really, really thought I was going to find more information on a fat positive movement. I think when I think about Africa, I do think that I think about every time I've heard about it when it comes to weight, is that they are more accepting, like all the various countries of Africa, they're very accepting, very body positive, but I could barely find any information to support that. Not that that's not happening. I think I think Africa as a whole is probably experiencing a culture change. So like research seems to suggest that Africans are becoming more concerned about obesity because diabetes is starting to take a rapid toll on the country. But I think because of that, I don't necessarily think that you're not going to be accepted, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Just because I guess, yeah, what I wrote was nothing I found suggests that you would be shamed. Like none of that came across in the research at all, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen. We have this quote from a student that wrote, in Tanzania, they're quite comfortable referring to people by their obvious physical attributes, the fat one, the skinny one, the Asian one. However, they do not have derogatory connotations as they would in the US. I am Chinese and was called China and konnichiwa numerous times. It was slightly jarring the first few times as I'm not used to this being acceptable, but people did not mean anything more than to get my attention or distinguish me from a larger group. So this kind of like Asia, where there are people that are literally, like she's saying, they're really just using it as a reference, not very much with this malicious intent. In South Africa, it's a little different, and mostly because in South Africa, it's a clear indication. If you are a plus size person, it's an indication that you do not have HIV, or they associate it with wealth. So, like I just said, research. There's so much out there. I feel like I say this in every single brief: research, research, research. There are plenty of fat travelers going abroad. I've come across a lot of different blogs, a lot of different experiences, and then they're also going to various places. They're not just like going to like one location. You can literally find them in multiple places. And then intercultural exchange. So we've kind of been loosely talking about this throughout the presentation. Like most identities, this is an opportunity to educate others about your identity if you feel comfortable about it. We like to tell our students at CGIS that you are an observer. You're not there to solve anything for this country. You're just there to experience another culture, another way of life, so that you can gain intercultural competency. But I think there is some room there for an intercultural exchange. There is room for a little bit of education. It's like a little gray spot where if people are actively asking you questions, I think a lot about this one student that wrote about her experience in Japan, and she was a Black woman and she had braids, and she was approached by a man and was just asking her questions about her braids, like where is she from, and like it was just question after question after question that ended with him smiling and saying thank you thank you in what English that he knew, to say thank you for speaking with me, and then he went about his business. And so I think when there is that other side, when they're asking you, there's definitely room there for you to teach them something about you. Katie was talking about how there's so much more to her, right? Like Katie, no one follows Katie on Instagram. I don't know, but I do. And Katie is a power lifter. And like, let me tell you, I don't know how she does it. It's crazy. Like, but like, there's so many other sides to us where we can, they can learn a little bit about us, but you have to do it. You have to do what feels comfortable for you. And if that's not your cup of tea, then okay.
So in terms of some challenges, we've mentioned clothing a few times, but more specifically for both men and women, I think undergarments, bras for people with breasts, like that is a really challenging thing to find things that fit you well and like comfortably in the US. And going kind of outside of your cultural sphere of knowledge and like where you are familiar with can definitely bring about challenges in finding those particular items that fit you well. So definitely know your measurements. Callie made a really great suggestion to bring like a little tape measure with you if you're going to be traveling abroad for like a semester or like a longer period of time, to write down your measurements so that you can compare to size charts. But definitely pack a good amount with you so that hopefully you don't have to buy any while you're abroad. But if you do have to buy them abroad, just know that it might take a little bit of searching and experimenting and knowing your measurements to find things that fit well. Another thing to keep in mind when we talk about traveling in a fat body is seats on airplane or other public spaces, public transit, auditoriums, things like that. So do your best to be able to do your research ahead of time. For most airlines, you can find out what type of like plane you're flying on, like a Boeing 747 or an Airbus, whatever. And you can actually look up the plane online and figure out like how big the seats are. There are some seats that tend to be bigger than others. And so if you get nervous or anxious about fitting in planes, that's a really great way to do your research ahead of time. Southwest Airlines also is probably one of the better airlines in the world for large body travelers. So they have a customer of size policy where you can buy 2 seats and then get refunded for your second seat after your flight. So that's really helpful. They don't have too many international flights, but that's great for traveling domestically and kind of in the North America, Caribbean region. But definitely do your research on what your airline's policy is on like, they usually call it like a customer of size policy, which is super politically correct, but that can be really helpful to do research and talk with your airline to figure out what your options are. Extenders for seatbelts are also really helpful. You can buy your own, just make sure that it's FAA approved so that it is like tested and rated for safety. But just be aware that not all extenders work for all airplanes and all airlines. Some airlines have different seatbelts. But it's a great thing to buy for yourself. And if you don't have one, the easiest thing I found is just right when I'm getting on the plane, I speak to the flight attendant and say like, hi, I'm in seat 24C and I'd like a seatbelt extender when you get a moment. And that's a great way to like not call attention to yourself if it bothers you, and also kind of take care of it right away so you're not worried about it. And then you can get settled and they'll bring your extender to you. So those are just some of my tips from traveling in a fat body.
A couple of other tips we have. So being mindful of size and weight limits, especially if it's a country where the people tend to look a little bit smaller than you are. They may not be, rating things for larger sizes. And so one thing is like zip lines. Now, I'm a health and safety assistant, so I made them put in the comment, don't do this anyway, because they can be not properly vetted in other countries and not have the same safety requirements you might expect here in the US. But if you are going to engage in using zip lines, make sure that it will be able to carry your weight fine. Rafting and boating, another thing is another thing to think about. Are the boats going to be the proper size for you? And also making sure there's life jackets in your size is going to be important. So maybe doing a little bit of research ahead of time. And also it's mindful for anybody, if you're gathering a group of people to go someplace and you're maybe like a straight size or mid size, being mindful of engaging in activities that are going to be size inclusive. And some things that are not that exclusive but good to be aware of is bringing shaping solutions. So like if you have like a certain like compression shorts or something like that you like to wear, or some kind of cream or something like that, good to bring with you. Also, any other kind of special toiletries you prefer to have, I always recommend, if you have a strong preference on toiletries, bring them with you. So because you can't guarantee necessarily that they're going to have it on your location.
So I know we've thrown a lot at you today. There is so much to consider when it comes to navigating this identity abroad. I know it's also easy for us to say, don't let it prevent you from taking adventures. I think as professionals who work within international education, like, we want you to go abroad. We've all been abroad and we've all experienced different things, and we can tell you for certain that it's impacted us in a very profound way. But that doesn't mean that it's that it was easy, right? And that it's going to always be happy moments, and that there aren't, it just comes with the territory when you're navigating something new. Kiera Liu wrote, "For me, China was a life-changing experience. It gave me the confidence to go after things I really want and show me that I really can do anything. Don't let something like that's the size of your jeans determine whether or not China is right for you. If you want to go, go. The only person stopping you is you. And while she's right, I definitely think there's more to consider. I think you definitely got to think critically about the experience that you're hoping to have, and then also thinking about those potential issues that you might encounter while you're abroad.
So we mentioned health at every size briefly. So I just wanted to mention, if you aren't familiar with it, you can look into that. And plus, we have a couple other resources that we found, and we think we might be helpful to you.
Going for next time on the CJIS Brief, the same time, same link in 2 weeks, Thursday, April 8th, we are going to be discussing the landscape of study abroad in a pandemic 2.0. We did an iteration of this in the fall semester, and things obviously have changed since then. So we're going to be updating everyone on the situation. So if nobody has any questions, that's it for today. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Also, it's our last one, so come see us next time.